This is the Happy Families podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. Dr. Justin Coulson sharing today on the issue of anxiety. How do we recognise it in our children? And then what do we do if we do recognise it? I'm Susie. Luke's here as well. Let's get into it.
Well,
so glad you're here.
Yeah, we need you because basically I don't know how we parent without you in our house.
We've had a child diagnosed with social anxiety. So recognising anxiety in our kids, big topic for us, but I think it is for a lot of families.
Yeah, statistically anxiety is, my friend Michael Gross has just written a book about anxiety and kids with Dr. Jodie Richardson, and they call it the common cold for kids in the psychological world. It's being diagnosed all over the place. It's such a big deal and so debilitating for our kids, as you would be experiencing.
Is there a perception that it's getting worse, or is there just a perception that we've been neglectful of understanding it?
I think there's a whole host of things, Luke. There's arguments that it's being overdiagnosed. There's certainly an argument that the definition has expanded and the criteria for meeting it has been loosened, so therefore more people are experiencing it. There's also the idea that the more people know about it, the more they're identifying it within themselves. Once upon a time we didn't talk about this stuff. Now everybody's going, oh, well, I have anxious moments. Maybe I've got anxiety. We're seeing, there's evidence that we're overprotecting our children and our paranoid parenting. I mean, you think about it. If you're paranoid, your kids are going to be paranoid. I'm using the word loosely, by the way. Please, I'm being a little bit glib and a bit loose. But, if the research shows that if we're highly controlling as parents, and I recognise as soon as I say this that some parents are going to start introspectively getting anxious about the most skilled person talking about anxiety can still invoke anxiety in others. So a little bit of a trigger warning here. But if you as a parent are highly controlling, what happens is you're essentially saying to your child, I believe that the world is unsafe, and therefore I need to control you, and I need to control what you're doing and where you're going and who you're being with, because I don't think that anything is safe. What your child learns, therefore, is that the world is unsafe, and so they become anxious because they believe the world is unsafe because you've taught them the world is unsafe. As you see their anxiety and their unwillingness to try new things or go new places or experience novel events, what then happens is you think, oh my goodness, my child is anxious, so I need to protect them even more. So we get this cycle, which is terribly damaging. Now, the evidence shows that parents are much more controlling and much more anxious than they ever have been, but this can be overcome, and I'm certainly not shaming parents right now, nor am I trying to make them feel guilty or anxious about their parenting, just highlighting a trend that seems to be increasingly evident when we look at how parents are doing. The good news is we can work around this, but I think the most important thing is we've got to be able to recognise what anxiety is.
Well, let's start at that point then. If we're looking at recognising anxiety in our children, what is anxiety?
Well, we could get really technical, but you can find the technical stuff on the internet. Look up the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's the kind of like the Bible for psychologists and psychiatrists, people who work in medical areas around mental health. They use the DSM, and it's got all the fancy definitions of what anxiety actually is. For our purposes, for our conversation today, I think it's easier to keep it fairly simple. Anxiety is the brain's natural response to something that could harm us. So if we experience anxiety, what happens is the amygdala, the part of the brain that's in charge of regulating fear responses in our emotional brain, it says, watch out, watch out, watch out, stay away. And all of a sudden we're on alert, we're on high alert because the anxiety increases. We're like, oh, need to stay away from this. That's kind of what anxiety is. It's a fear response that says, I need to be aware something bad might happen here.
So that's not a bad thing.
Not at all.
That's actually a good level of anxiety should be warning us to stay away.
100%. This is what I say to parents all the time. If your kids are a bit anxious, or if you're a bit anxious, be glad. Anxiety keeps us safe. The problem with an anxiety disorder, or somebody who is just highly or over anxious, let's not even get into the psychopathology, just a really anxious kid, is that they start to get anxious about everything. They start to see something to be worried about in everything. And what research tells us with kids that have got anxiety is that they're actually drawn to threatening information. And so something that's completely ambiguous, something that's not really dangerous at all, nothing threatening, they will hear it and wonder, oh, I wonder if I could perceive something dangerous about that. And what then happens is they tend to dwell on it for much longer. They ruminate, they cogitate. They're like, oh my goodness, do I need to be worried about this? I think that I should be worried because this sounds like it could be scary. You know, at the dinner table, we might say something about what we're going to get up to this weekend. And it can be completely innocuous, completely safe, or it might have a degree of ambiguity. We're going to go for a walk in the hinterland, and when we walk up there, just make sure you stay away from the edge because there are going to be some cliffs.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, one child's going to be like, oh, that sounds awesome. We're going to have family time. We're going to be in nature. We're going to be exploring. We're going to be adventuring. And the child who has that predisposition towards anxiety says, uh-oh, I don't want to do it. Because if there's cliffs, something might happen to me or somebody that I love, and they ruminate over it, and they're drawn to that aspect of the information. So that's kind of what's going on. The amygdala is going, red alert, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's in charge of thinking things through logically, gets overridden.
Our nephew one time asked a question when he was going on school camp, is there palm trees? Coconut trees. And they said, yes, there's some coconut trees around. He said, I'm not going. And he refused to go because a week earlier someone had said more people die from coconuts falling on your head than whatever the fun stat was. And he just went, if there's coconut trees, I could die.
Great example. Now, we're not saying that young man has anxiety, but what we're saying is that if we've got a predisposition mentally to be drawn towards those kinds of things, that can invoke anxiety in us and invoke an anxiety response.
Yeah.
Okay, so understanding what the problem is then, Justin, how do we as parents recognise that in our children?
Let me give you a list. I've actually come prepared today for the first time ever. I've got a list of 10 things. Now, we could do a list of 20 things or 30 things. There are so many ways that anxiety shows up, but the 10 most common that I sort of scribbled down are these. If you're dealing with school refusal, there's a reasonable argument that there could be some anxiety. There could be any number of other reasons as well, but certainly school refusal is one way that anxiety shows up. Anger is a big one because kids don't know how to control their emotions, so they just have these outbursts. And it's not that they're actually angry, it's that they're scared. Yeah. Anger is a secondary emotion. It comes from somewhere else, in this case, fear and anxiety. You know that anxiety could be showing up if your child says, what if? And you give them an answer and you say, yeah, but what if? But what if? And no matter how logical you are and how many answers you give them, they keep saying, what if, what if, what if, what if? That could be an indication that their brain is in overprotection mode. Tears, lots and lots of tears. And specifically, I don't know. And you say, but what about this? And you go, I don't know. And the kids just don't have an answer for anything. They just don't know anything at all. When they can't walk, when their limbs are so sore, that's an indication that there could be some anxiety. When they can't sleep, when they're jittery and bouncy, when they've got a sore tummy, when they're feeling sick, or when they're just super clingy. They don't want to let you go, especially if they're 15 or 16. But even when they're 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, these are ways that anxiety shows up. There are other ways, of course. This is a short list, but it sort of gives you an indication of how we might see
okay, so we've got the problem of anxiety, how to recognise it. We've got a few clues there. So if we start to recognise some of these things and we actually think maybe our child is anxious, what do we do?
Well, we could spend 2 weeks talking about that on the show. I don't think that we have time for that.
No, we've got time. We've got time.
Okay, all right, let's go.
Sit back.
Well, just order Uber Eats. We'll be fine.
I reckon there's a couple of things that might be helpful. The first is that we don't argue against it. We don't try to tell our child that they're being silly, to cut it out, to stop it, that they're overreacting. That doesn't tend to be helpful. Instead, a little bit of empathy can go a really long way. And the best way for me to describe that, rather than giving you words or a technique, is to provide a metaphor. I may have actually used this metaphor before when we've had conversations. The metaphor of the balance beam seems really apt to me. Your child's walking along the balance beam of life. It looks like they might topple. Anxiety is they're starting to topple, and when you see them start to fall, you've got a couple of options. You can watch them land on the ground, which doesn't sound particularly kind, or you can jump up and give them a great big hug and carry them across the balance beam yourself and say, look, you made it. Everything's okay. It's all done. But that's not necessarily helpful either, because our kids have actually got to walk across that balance beam themselves. That's what life is all about. I think that it's much more helpful if we recognise that they're starting to feel anxious, they're starting to feel worried, and empathy and encouragement look like this. We reach up and metaphorically put a hand on their leg while they're up there on that beam, and we say, I can see you starting to tip, but I've got you. I'm here. I know that you're a little bit nervous. I know you're a little bit worried about this. I know it's causing you a little bit of stress, but I'm right here with you. How can I help? So what we're doing is we're saying, I get it. I know it's hard for you, and I'm right beside you. But we're also saying very clearly, while I'm not going to let you fall, I will not carry you. because you've got to walk across this beam yourself.
Yeah.
We're setting a really clear boundary saying, I've got all the empathy in the world. Now I want to encourage you. And so we say, I'm going to take my hand off now and I want you to take the next step. I know you can do this. Empathy and encouragement.
Yeah, that's good, because I think sometimes it's good to remember that whole idea of saying to our children, I can't do this for you. You have got to be the one to do this, but what can I do to help? Is a really good, safe approach. I think about that even just in relation to our children. One of our sons had an operation recently and he did really well. He wasn't super anxious about it, but I found myself getting that way. Yeah. But that became a good question to ask myself is, what do I need to help myself through this? As an adult, I can ask that. But as a child, we don't think to. So we as the parent need to kind of provide that question.
Right. So empathy and encouragement kind of goes, I see how hard this is for you and I'm here. That's the empathy part. And then the encouragement part is, how can I help?
Yeah.
And if they say, I want you to do it for me, you say, I can't lay on the operating table for you. I wish I could, but I can't do that. But I'm right here. What else can I do? How can I help? The second thing that I was going to suggest is breathing. There's power in breath. There's power in, taking good deep breaths. There's all sorts of apps. There's websites. There's instructions all over the internet. I'm not going to. Different breathing techniques work for different ways for different people. But I reckon, as a parent, if you've got a child who feels anxiety, it's worth investing half an hour on the internet to find the right one for you and for your child and give it a go. It's remarkable how breathing and mindfulness can reduce anxiety and restore much more effective thinking.
I know, hearing what you say, it always resonates with me, and I know how powerful it is. But what you've got is a response of peace and a response of calm and control from the parent. Usually when we see these symptoms of anxieties, they can come up in moments where we're not feeling that.
Right.
And so our response to those symptoms of anxiety is to yell, to get frustrated, to force them through. And then what we feel afterwards when we realise we've done it wrong is a whole lot of guilt and shame as a parent. That's how we responded. But I mean, is it just as simple as going, okay, I know how I should respond, so I'm going to keep working on preparing myself? Because you don't always predict when they're going to come out.
No, that's right. And the most common thing that I hear from parents when their child's going through some sort of anxiety moment is, would you just calm down? Calm down, calm down, calm down. Yeah. And what child has ever looked at their parent in that moment and said,
oh, you're right.
Good reminder.
Yeah, thanks, Mum. Yeah.
That's all I needed.
I just need to take 3 deep breaths and I'll be fine.
Yeah. Don't be silly. You're right. I am being silly.
They don't do that at all. I get this question all the time. People say, Justin, are you always calm? The answer is no, not always, but most of the time. And the reason that I am is I've practiced. And every time I've got it wrong, I've gone, okay, that was that moment that I got wrong. Next time, how am I going to respond? And every time you get it right, you're like, oh, nailed it.
Yeah,
just
it feels great.
Feels amazing. And it feels so good that you can sort of say, well, if I can do it once, I can do it again.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that anybody listening to this right now knows that in their child's anxious moments, they've completely blown it. But they've also got it absolutely right at different times. We concentrate on the times we got it right. Forget the steps, because you're going to forget them anyway. Just be the kind of person who is kind and responsive and encouraging. That's all you need to do.
I had a moment recently where Susie had a couple of days, with Royden in hospital, and I was taking care of 2 children by myself, and they were beautiful with each other, and they were so beautiful with me, and they did everything they were asked first time. Like this was unbelievable. And so the first night with them, and the next morning, the school, there was just so much calm and peace because they were just so incredible. And they joked about it, and Tyson said, "We've been like the best ever. Like we've never been that good for Dad." And then during the day, I thought, I don't want my calm to be down to how well behaved they are as kids. I should have more control than that. So then the next afternoon and the next morning, when they weren't quite as responsive, I was pre-planned in those spaces to go, I'm going to be calm no matter what they do. This is who I want to be. And it was hard. There was one point where I almost got mid sort of little sort of yell reaction, and I caught myself and turned it into that. I'm just joking that I'm getting worked up, boys. But it took me being the pre-thought of who I wanted to be as a dad before those moments came that enabled me to do that.
Yeah, so hard to do, but the more you practice it, the easier it gets. Great story. Love hearing you share that.
Dr. Justin Coulson is our guest. Thank you so much. This is a really important conversation.
So good.
One that's very significant to have, and thank you for navigating us through it.
That's a pleasure. Thanks.
For more information on this and many other topics, head to the Happy Families website. It's happyfamilies.com.au. If, of course, you're interested in chatting with Justin yourself or having him speak at your event, find out more details at justincoulson.com.